Today's occurrence happens in the state of Texas, in one of the most beautiful and dangerous natural landmarks, Jacob's Well. Don Dibble is a dive shop owner with over 4 decades of diving experience. He had been called out to Jacob's Well several times before to help remove the remains of divers who went too deep. So imagine his surprise in the summer of 1980, when Don dove back into Jacob's Well to check on the grate of rebar that he set with concrete to seal off the entrance to the third chamber. And instead of seeing the grate, he saw a note written on plastic slate that said, "You can't keep us out." People would go on to die in Jacob's Well in the years following, and one diver would take 21 years to be found. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and these are the stories of the lives lost in Jacob's Well. Now, if you're familiar with the hill country of Texas, you might have heard of Jacob's Well before. The place looks like a paradise fairy tale. It has crystal clear water that shimmers in the sunlight. It's framed by limestone cliffs and surrounded by lush greenery. Well, Jacob's Well comes with a dark side, because it's also one of the most dangerous underwater caves in the world. It's the most dangerous in Texas, and it's claimed the lives of at least 9 divers who thought they could handle it. Jacob's Well is located in Texas Hill Country near a small town called Wimberley. It's not far from Austin, so a lot of people make the drive out for a day trip. It's a spring-fed well, which means the water is incredibly clear and cool, even on the 100-plus degree days. You can see straight down into it, and if you've ever stood at the edge of a well, it looks like an endless hole. So people get that mix of feelings where it looks cool and scary at the same time. The well is about 12 feet in diameter at the surface. It starts as a swimming hole for people to swim and dive in due to an overflow of water. From there, it goes down vertically into an extensive cave system. The deepest part of the system is 140 feet or 43 meters deep, and there are at least 6 chambers inside of it. Depending on who you ask, the number of chambers and where they stop and start varies, so I'll be referencing the most common diagrams. The chambers get more dangerous the lower they are, with the 5th and 6th chambers being so narrow that they've barely been accessed. Because Jacob's Well is a natural spring, it's fed by the Trinity Aquifer, which pushes water up through the limestone and into Cypress Creek. The same force that pushes the water up into the well is the force that divers have to fight to swim down into the cave system at the bottom. So from the opening of the well, the cave goes down vertically for about 30 feet, before extending horizontally another 50 feet or so. That part is Chamber 1, and it's the easiest to access. It's the part of the well where recreational swimmers and divers can explore. It's very open and pretty safe as long as you don't go too deep. The sun reaches all throughout it, so it's very bright. Chamber 2 is where things can get dicey. It goes down to about 80 feet deep, and there's a false chimney inside of it that looks like a way out, but it's actually a dead end. There's a restricted opening going into Chamber 3, where the cave system gets tight and silty. Experienced divers can make it through, but because the chamber is a small room with the floor full of unstable gravel, divers have to inflate water wings to get through Chamber 3 successfully, without dislodging the gravel or stirring up silt and causing a silt out, where they would have zero visibility. The passage into Chamber 3 is incredibly deadly. Only a handful of extremely skilled cave divers in the world have ever gone to this part of the cave. Even fewer have come out. It's extremely tight and has passageways that twist and lead nowhere. It's been described as feeling like the walls are closing in on you. Of the few divers that have been in this part of the cave, they report getting stuck or disoriented in this chamber. Previous divers have had to remove their air tanks to get into Chamber 4, but recently the San Marcos Area Recovery Team was able to get into it without having to remove their air tanks. Inside of it, there's a tight restriction leading to a tunnel where there's a knife edge formation in the ceiling and fine gravel below. It apparently has amazing limestone formations and no gravel, but extremely fine silt that one misstep will lead to losing visibility. So each of the chambers has its own challenges, but the deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets. There's something about the way the well is structured that makes it incredibly deceptive. Because on the surface, it looks peaceful and inviting. The area open to swim in is open and clear. Add that to 68-degree water in 100+ degree weather, it completely contradicts what everything beyond Chamber 1 turns into. On September 9, 1979, a group of 20 people arrived at Jacob's Well. Most people in the group were setting up camp for the evening on the land surrounding it. They all came from Pasadena, Texas, which is just south of Houston. But 20-year-old Kent Maupin and Mark Brashear and a few others planned to dive into the cave system before everyone else got into the water and disturbed the silt the next day. Kent was an experienced diver. He was an assistant instructor and a part-time employee at a dive shop. He had also been diving since the age of 12. Now, Kent had previously talked about rumors of a squeeze that very few divers had gone through that led to a vast room. The squeeze in chamber had killed 4 people prior to this trip, and everyone knew it. So the plan was just for a few of the experienced divers to go in and look around a little after midnight. They started their dive, and getting into Chamber 3 was a bit of a squeeze, but everyone made it fine. And then another diver with them, named Joe Moy, looks over to where Kent and Mark are, and they have, I guess, impulsively decided to check out Chamber 4. But Joe sees Kent and Mark remove their air tanks and turn around to go squeeze backwards through the entrance to Chamber 4. They pulled their tanks behind them. Joe, stunned, started flashing his light to get their attention because he had an aluminum tank that had more air than the steel tanks Mark and Kent were using. Joe was already low on air, and on top of that, he knew they didn't have any backup lights or even a safety line. Mark went in last, and he either didn't see the flashing light or chose to ignore it because he didn't look up at Joe at all. Joe stayed for as long as he could. He even used a knife to bang on his air tank, trying to get a response. Unfortunately, no response came, and he had to leave because he was running out of air. He left his light shining at the squeeze into Chamber 4 and left. Right when he made it to the surface, the clear water turned silty. There was no visibility at all, and it was clear that Mark and Kent wouldn't be able to make it out. The police were called out, and the Hays County Volunteer Body Recovery Unit sent a team of 4 divers. Don Dibble was the leader of the recovery team. They wouldn't make it to Jacob's Well until a little before dawn. In the meantime, a few members of the diving group that came with Mark and Kent tried to go in and look for them. They couldn't find them, but one person did 2 90-minute dives and said they saw their bodies buried in a pile of gravel. So 2 recovery divers went in but couldn't find them. What they did see was that the squeeze that Kent went through was almost completely closed off with gravel. They realized they needed more divers, so they planned to come back the next day and start around 10 a.m. Kent's parents made it to the area sometime that day and stood on the banks of the river waiting for Kent's remains. 2 divers went down to try and move the gravel with tools so that they could get through, but they couldn't. So Don Dibble and another diver went down to check it out for themselves. Don had about 10 minutes of air left when he finally made it to the entrance for Chamber 4. He was using a safety line and hesitated going through the squeeze. He used his light and realized that it was clear the gravel would have to be moved before trying to recover any remains. Right when he realized that, he was trapped by a gravel slide. It pinned both of his arms to the point where he couldn't jerk on the safety line or even hit his air tank to signal for help. He tried his best to release himself with the few minutes of air he had left. And right when Don accepted that he was going to die, his body spasmed in a way that somehow freed him. The diver he was with gave him the regulator to the spare tank. So Don shoved it in his mouth, and when he did, he inhaled so hard that he swallowed air too. He tried to burp it out, but obviously he couldn't, so he just had to hold on to it while he was pulled to the surface. As he ascended, the air that he swallowed expanded and caused so much pain, but they didn't really have a choice but to keep going. Don was initially diagnosed as having an embolism, but after an x-ray, they realized He had a ruptured stomach wall and a peritonitis. Kent's siblings told Dawn he was scared someone else might get hurt or killed trying to get their brother out, and they didn't want to see that happen. But Dawn Dibble was obviously out of the picture for the recovery now, so another expert was called in. They had the same opinion as Dawn and said that the gravel would have to be removed. So a professional diving company was contacted to come in and remove the gravel with suction devices. A week into removing the gravel, another gravel slide pinned a worker, so another diver was sent down to help free him. After 2 more days of clearing out the area, it was finally open enough to attach a video camera to a broom handle to stick through. The tape showed a low, broad vaulted room. They couldn't tell how big it was, but they could see a glimpse of a tank valve and a regulator mouthpiece. The next day, they managed to clear more gravel, and a diver managed to get almost to the end of the tight entrance into Chamber 4. They could see the floor drop off into the chamber on the camera he was wearing, but they couldn't see any scuba gear or bodies. It was possible they were above the diver since they couldn't see the ceiling, but to actually get into the room, they would have to remove 2 large boulders. So they decided to stop the recovery until there was funding established for something that extensive. 2 days later, they were back at it, but there was more gravel. So they realized that their efforts were in vain because the gravel would just keep refilling the entrance. It was endless. After 12 days worth of recovery efforts, a second professional opinion said the same thing to call off the recovery. And then, in January of 1980, a few months later, Dawn Dibble and another diver set up a barrier that was put up to seal off the well at 75 feet, blocking off the 3rd chamber. 6 months later, it was removed by divers who left the note. Mark Brashear's remains were washed out of the well during a flood in 1981, 10 years after entering Jacob's Well. Now, Kent Maupin took longer, so I'll revisit that later. A few years after Mark and Kent's accident, there was another. At this point, there had been 8 fatalities in the past 29 years in Jacob's Well, so it was completely closed off to diving. Swimming with a permit was okay, but there was absolutely no diving. On Wednesday, November 23, 1983, at about 8:30 p.m., 22-year-old Richard Patton and a friend entered Jacob's Well. They each had normal scuba diving gear and lights. They were both members of an advanced diving class at Southwest Texas State University. Both were described as extremely experienced and intelligent divers. When they made it down to 90 feet, they were able to go through. Since the metal gate had been removed, Richard and his friend were able to continue on to Chamber 3 and got to the entrance of Chamber 4. They removed their air tanks and pushed them in front of them while they followed behind, breathing through their hoses. While Richard was trying to push through, his tank got stuck, so they had to abandon it. Richard and his friend started ascending towards the surface using buddy breathing and sharing his friend's tank as they ascended. But while they were going up, they entered into the false chimney in Chamber 2. They didn't realize it was a false exit until the air was almost out. Richard's friend was able to swim down and out after realizing it wasn't the right way to go and made it into the right passage, going back towards the entrance. The next day, Richard Patton was recovered from the false chimney. They didn't use a line for their dive. If they had, Richard might have been able to make it out with his friend. They also weren't cave trained, so there's that. And I don't mean to speculate, but I do have my questions about if the tank was shared and Richard's friend managing to swim down and find the correct passage with it, and Richard just couldn't pull it together, or if something more suspicious happened. But considering how little information I had access to for that particular accident, I'm going to stop myself from the rabbit hole I want to go down and move on. Because the next year, another accident happened. On February 26, 1984, 3 divers went into Jacob's Well. John Wilcox and Danny Self were both diving instructors. 36-year-old Wayne Russell was a cave diver with 12 years of experience. Their goal was to quickly map the cave and get overall dimensions. They didn't get the landowner's permission for this, so they knew they had to hurry because technically they were trespassing. At first glance, they seemed well prepared and started the dive at 7:50 p.m. As they descended, they placed a guideline and first secured it at 25 feet deep, around the part where chamber 1 turns horizontal. They also left one 50 cubic foot tank with an octopus regulator there. The octopus is like a backup air supply. You can connect it to a tank to share air with someone who either ran out or is having issues with their own air supply for whatever reason. It connects using a long yellow hose, hence the name, but it keeps divers from trying to share the same breathing mouthpiece, which rarely works out. John, Danny, and Wayne each had 3 lights per person, depth and pressure consoles, and a single 60 cubic foot tank. They secured the line again at 50, 75, and 90 feet. Once they made it to the 4th chamber, they checked the air pressure. Danny stayed in the 4th chamber to maintain the safety line. Wayne led the way and continued to lay line going into chamber 5. He pushed his tank in front of him to go through the narrow opening, and John followed behind him taking pictures. Wayne and John continued into chamber 6. Danny saw an old tank that he believed could have been left by Mark and Kent that was never recovered in the 5th chamber, so he went to go grab it. He picked up some spare line and removed his tank to squeeze through the passage to get to chamber 5. Once he made it in, he found the tank and tied the piece of spare line to it before turning and following the safety line out. Danny was kind of shocked at how narrow the 5th chamber was. He estimated it was maybe 2 feet high. He was also starting to get a little worried because the visibility was getting bad. About halfway out of chamber 5, Danny got tangled in the line he tied to the old tank and realized he couldn't go any further with it. He took a deep breath and managed to untangle the line around himself and made it back into the 4th chamber. After making it back through, he put on his tank and tried to pull the old tank back through the opening, but it was stuck. Meanwhile, John and Wayne are in the 6th chamber. Wayne used a 100-foot measuring tape to measure the lower area. John was trying to take pictures of everything inside, but the visibility was getting bad, so he wasn't able to really capture anything. At some point, Wayne signaled to John that it was time to go, so they both swam back following the safety line. John led the way. When they made it to the opening going from chamber 5 to 4, they saw the old tank stuck inside of it. John was able to push it while Danny pulled it from the other side, and they got it through the opening. Then Danny turned and exited the 4th chamber, going into the 3rd while carrying the tank. John left the 5th chamber and went into the 4th with Wayne right behind him. By the time they got into the 3rd chamber, the visibility was better. But it's Danny and John now, and there's no sign of Wayne. So Danny signals and asks John where Wayne is, and John points down to the tunnel going into the 4th chamber. John assumed Wayne was still working with his survey tape or putting his tank back on, since Wayne was right behind him when they left the 4th chamber. There wasn't a sign or indication that anything was wrong with Wayne, so they figured he would catch up during his decompression stop. Halfway through the decompression stop, Danny and John started to get nervous because there was no sign of Wayne. They waited a little longer than needed, but they couldn't really do anything when Wayne didn't appear. They couldn't go back down because they were too low on air and had no bottom time left. Bottom time is the total length of time a diver stays underwater, and it doesn't include stops. So since they had neither of those things, they were forced to surface. They waited by the well for a few minutes, and then at 9:16 p.m., they called the sheriff's office. Wayne Russell's remains were recovered the next day at 12:17 p.m. He was found in the 5th chamber, lying on the safety line with an empty tank and his mask still in place. The coroner said the cause of death was drowning. There hasn't really been an answer as to why Wayne didn't come up with John and Danny. It's possible he used his air up faster than the other two, or nitrogen narcosis played a factor. But if John said that he was right behind him entering the 4th chamber, it could also be possible he wasn't able to make it back through the opening if it was tight. But there weren't any solid conclusions on what kept Wayne from surfacing. Wayne's friends said he was a veteran caver and cave diver and loved mapping caves. He had mapped several in the past. They also said he prioritized safety. But upon digging a bit more, I found that Wayne was a member of the National Speleological Society. He served as the vice chairman and the chairman of the Texas Speleological Association during the 1970s. and he helped found several clubs over the years. He was also a member of the cave diving section of the National Speleological Society, but he was not actually certified for cave diving. As far as I can tell, his caving usually focused on mapping dry caves and cave photography. He was from Austin, Texas, and his day job was working as a mail carrier. John and Danny weren't even part of the National Speleological Society at all, and were also not cave diving certified, and they both ended up being arrested after Wayne's death. Now, after Kent and Mark's passing, the rules became stricter. Jacob's Well sits on around 80 acres of land that is a natural area open to the public daily for hiking and viewing the spring. There's self-guided tours, wildlife watching opportunities, and a picnic area. They have the works. Soon, swimming started requiring permits to be there, and diving was first restricted to certified divers only. When open water divers continued to break the rules and go into the caves that had signs telling them to keep out, diving was cut. Today, only cave diving research organizations are given permission to dive there. The San Marcos Area Recovery Team, known as SMART, is one of the organizations allowed to dive there. In October of 2000, Dan and Kathy, Missy Oshek, along with member Jim Price, entered Jacob's Well. They had a huge team on the surface overseeing everything while they videotaped the area. The SMART team had already worked for 5 years with one of the surrounding private landowners to the well. They would take water samples and map the cave for possible recovery missions. Because even though Mark's remains were washed out during the flood in 1981, Kent's were still in the cave. Dan, Kathy, and Jim didn't go down to look for remains. They partly believed that Kent had probably been moved in a flood like Mark. But Dan spotted the first signs of Kent down a keyhole opening in the floor of the fourth chamber. He first spotted a femur bone, then another femur bone. So he went into the keyhole-shaped tunnel and saw heavily corroded equipment. Dan said it was obvious what he stumbled upon was human remains, and he spotted a human skull nearby too. It was when he saw a Neptune's Locker Diving Association patch from Kent's hometown of Pasadena, Texas, that he realized this was most likely Kent Maupin. At the bottom of the tunnel, he could see Kent's corroded scuba tank with the hoses still attached. And the tank was still attached to a beaver tail-style wetsuit with a weight belt. Don carefully left the area to keep the scene intact while he continued recording. While Don, Kathy, and Jim left, someone accidentally kicked up silt. They had to fight their instincts to panic and keep calm when they lost visibility and rushed to find the guidelines. In the process of getting to the line, they ditched their cameras. The group followed the arrows on the line up to a shallower depth to decompress before surfacing. The silt out was so bad when it happened that Dan passed Jim on the way out and didn't even know. The camera kept recording until it ran out of tape, but divers later went in to grab it and Kent's remains. The film shows when everything went black in the cave from the silt, and it just stayed black until it stopped filming. Dan once said he felt the call of the well inside of Jacob's Well. It was the only time he thinks his judgment on a cave dive was truly affected by nitrogen narcosis. He was diving with Kathy, and they had agreed to stop the dive at the third chamber. But on that dive, Dan started trying to go into the fourth chamber. Kathy grabbed his foot to stop him. Now Kent's parents, Malcolm and Mary Maupin, received word that their son's remains may have been located after 20 years. Malcolm said he was grateful Kent had finally been found, but he was angry at the same time because the way he heard the news was because a newspaper reporter called him to ask how he felt about the possibility that his son's remains were found. Malcolm said it was hard to relive it after so long, and that he wishes he was there that night to stop his son. They used to dive together. Malcolm was Kent's favorite diving partner. If he was there, he might still have a son. Mary, Kent's mother, said there's no way to know what would have happened if things were different, but she could have lost a son and husband if it were. While many of the known deaths in Jacob's Well are not widely publicized for the family's privacy, there have been many near-death experiences in the well too. The most recent near-death experience happened in 2015, when a freediver was filming his dive in Jacob's Well. Freediving is different than scuba diving because freedivers do not use air tanks. They take a deep breath and dive just on that alone. On July 13th, 2015, Diego tried to free dive Jacob's Well and recorded it. It wasn't his first time doing it. Diego said he's done it more times than he can count, and that he slowly progressed further into the cave inch by inch because safety is his #1 priority. His dive on July 13th started off normal until he reached a depth of 100 feet. Diego was at the entrance to the 3rd chamber when he lost his flipper. He immediately had flashbacks of another freediver who lost his flipper while freediving in a cave. When that diver chose to go get their flipper, they blacked out before they made it back to the surface. Diego realized that he needed to get back to the surface as soon as possible. When he saw his flipper fall away from him, the rush of adrenaline depleted his oxygen faster than normal. He knew he had to cut off his weight belt to make it to the surface in time. He pushed off the cave wall, and everything went black when his flashlight fell off of his wrist. Luckily, Diego was ready with a backup light and a backup light for the backup light. He said that was the first time that ever happened to him. For a split second, he thought of death and dying that day. He was able to stop those thoughts and focus only on the present moment of what was happening, and not what the worst thing that could happen was. Diego knew he had trained for this, and he could handle whatever was thrown his way. The worst thing to do in a situation like that is panic, because panic is what leads to most deaths. His camera kept rolling the entire time, and Diego swam up to the light at the top of the well. In the video, you can hear how he struggled to breathe. It's something called the mammalian dive reflex, where after holding your breath for an extended period of time, your diaphragm starts to contract to keep your lungs from collapsing after being underwater too long. The video stops right when Diego reaches the surface of Jacob's Well. The landowner for Jacob's Well in 2001 said that when the spring dried up for the first time in history during the summer of 2000, it was a wake-up call for everyone. It was a sign of the region's increasing water shortage and quality problems. And the landowner said he didn't want to turn Jacob's Well into Jacob's Cave. But in 2022, Jacob's Well dried up again, and it's been dry ever since. For the past 2 years, there's been no swimming in Jacob's Well because the spring stopped flowing due to drought, growing population, and overpumping in Hays County, which is shocking because it was once impossible to actually go into Jacob's Well. The spring used to push out water 10 to 30 feet into the air for centuries. In 1924, the flow rate was 170 gallons per second. In the 1950s, people would visit Jacob's Well and jump over and around the springs that came up all along Cypress Creek. It was impossible to go more than 2 feet below the surface because of the force of the spring. Today, there are 9 known fatalities at Jacob's Well, but it's believed there may have actually been 12. All of the fatalities in Jacob's Well have happened with divers not certified for cave diving. As it goes, stop doing things you're not certified to do. Don't assume that you somehow are better than everyone else and you can beat the odds and do it. Just stop, read the signs, take a moment to think, and then go home. Stay safe, follow or subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll be back next Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.